Welcome everyone to Book Sandwiched In. And this week, George Farr will be reviewing a book. And the book is A Civil War Courtship, The Letters of Edwin Weller from Antietam to Atlanta by William Walton. George Farr is a local history enthusiast, a researcher, and a lecturer. And the author of A Civil War Courtship was the grandson of the woman who was the subject of these letters. Like last week, please hold your questions till the end, and I'll read the questions aloud. And we're going to mute everybody so that we won't have the background noise that could interfere. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce George Farr.
Thank you, Barbara, for asking me to present a book review. You mentioned the title, and I would like to mention the fact that I get a lot of the books that I buy from bookfinder.com. And this particular book is available there for less than $10, which also includes shipping. This book has a catchy title, but there were a number of letters written before Antietam and after Atlanta. A more factually accurate title would have been The Letters of Edwin Weller from Fort Lyon, Virginia to Bladenburg, Maryland. Fort Lyon was the regiment's first camp location after reaching Washington, and Bladensburg, Maryland was their location where they were mustered out of the service and returned to Elmira. I'm not typically a reader of books. For the most part, I use books for research. The books that I read will hopefully provide me with some factual information that relates to my current interests or study, and they are typically more historical in nature, which makes a great deal of sense because I was a history major in college, which I should mention did not lead directly to any form of life-sustaining activity for me. Many of you may recall the book review my wife Kathy gave not too long ago. She is a major reader of books. In fact, she made me move a large bookcase into our bedroom. In 1981, I returned to this area from Maryland, where I had lived since 1971. Shortly after moving back, I took an interest in a local American Civil War regiment, the 107th New York Volunteer Infantry. I recall that I participated in a presentation regarding that unit with Jim Hare and others at the Chemung County Historical Society, and I believe that was in 1982. In 1992, I was forced into semi-retirement because of health problems, and that is when I began a more intensified study of the 107th participation in the Civil War. This is the unit that raised the statue in the 1880s in front of the county buildings on Lake Street. Early on, I found this book in the local library and eventually purchased my own copy. At the time, I couldn't imagine that this book would lead me to a 36-chapter newspaper article that would cover the regiment's experiences from their raising in Chemung, Steuben, and Schuyler counties to their return home at the end of the war. But there were enough clues in the book that I was able to track down the series of articles. They were published during 1869 and 1870 in the Havana Journal. The journal exists on microfilm in the Montour Falls Library. I spent a substantial amount of time copying the series to paper. However, even more amazing was that I could never imagine that I would eventually meet and befriend the person who had the actual letters contained in the book. I suspect that the average person wouldn't be interested in reading a book that was closely associated with the American Civil War. Many, if not most of them, are a technical analysis of campaigns and battles. A Civil War courtship is nothing like that. The author of this book, William Edwin Walton, in addition to being a writer, was for a time the chairman of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts in Washington, and he was a close friend of John F. Kennedy and his wife, Jacqueline. He died in 1994. Walton was the grandson of Edwin Weller and Antoinette Watkins, or Nettie, as her family and her friends called her. They are the principal characters in the book, and the main source of the material in the book are the letters Edwin wrote to Nettie during the war. So how did the letters become source material for William Walton? When Nettie died, she left the letters to her daughter, who was Walton's mother. When his mother died, she left the letters to his sister, Helen Walton Hackett. When she died, she left the letters to her daughter, Susan Hackett, who in turn provided the letters to William. Susan is unmarried and continues to have possession of Edwin's letters, journal, and scrapbook. She lives in Colorado and has mentioned the possibility of donating the material to the Chemung County Historical Society. I have selected a number of letters to read that provide an idea of their content throughout the book, and I have also added some additional material not in the book in order to provide some background. You can show Edwin's photograph. This is a photograph of him in his sergeant's uniform. He was inducted into or joined the regiment and was commissioned as sergeant right away. Edwin Weller lived on his father's farm on the Ridge Road in the town of Veteran. At that time, he worked in Daniel Tracy's dry goods store on Main Street in Havana, which we know today as Montour Falls. Tracy's wife was the sister of Antoinette Nettie Watkins. Nettie and Edwin's father were the recipients of Edwin's 52 letters written during his service with 107th New York between August 26, 1862 and May 27, 1865. Considering his lack of education, Edwin's letters are very good in terms of content and form. Nettie's letters to Edwin, unfortunately, did not survive. You can show Nettie's picture. The book begins in the summer of 1862. President Lincoln has called for an additional 300,000 troops following the failure of the Peninsula Campaign against Richmond. A new regiment, the 107th, is being raised in Chemung, Steuben, and Schuyler counties. Edwin Weller, although from the town of Veteran in Chemung County, joins the regiment in Schuyler County and goes off to war. The regiment arrives in Washington on August 15th, where President Lincoln and Secretary of State Seward of New York State review the regiment and present a regimental banner to them for being the first regiment to reach Washington in answer to his call for more troops. That banner never saw battle, as it was left in the possession of Seward and is now on display on the second floor at the Chemung County Historical Society. After the ceremony, the regiment crossed the Potomac River and went into camp in Northern Virginia, manning one of the many forts guarding Washington. Fort Lyon was where Edwin writes his first letter to Nettie on August 26, 1862. His letters will start out, as Walton characterized, as those from one friend to another. Edwin will inquire about Nettie's social life and will quite often mention his experiences with respect to his encounters with the young ladies of the South, and more infrequently his war experiences. He begins the letter with "Friend Net." He goes on to describe their camp and their duty in Fort Lyon. He states that I like soldiering full as well as I expected to. I think if you could see me now, you would laugh. Net, I am raising a fine mustache. Just wait till I get back to Havana. The people will think I am some foreign gentleman. Net, how does all of the young people flourish now? Do you have your usual set twos nowadays, or rather nights? How I should like to be in Havana just one night and have an old-fashioned time. Remember me to all of the young folks in Havana. I shall expect to hear from you very soon. I hope that you will not fail to do so. Very respectfully, your friend, Edwin Weller. No letters survive from their first battle on September 17th at Antietam, or their following camp at Maryland Heights above Harper's Ferry, where they suffered a great many deaths due to the disease that was brought on the poor location of their camp. At this point, I want to tell you a story that is not in the book, but easily could have been mentioned by Edwin in a letter to Nettie. Edwin's company commander was Captain Erastus Clark, who had been recruited from Utica, New York, because it was thought that there was no one in Schuyler County capable of commanding a company of 100 men. Clark had been wounded at the Battle of Antietam. Evidently, Clark's mother was made aware of his being wounded, and she traveled all the way from Utica, accompanied by the family doctor. She found him at a home near the battlefield, where he had been taken following the battle. When he was able to travel in several days, they left by train back to New York State. I discovered this particular event fully described in detail in 29 pages of a book from Crossroads of War by S. Roger Keller in 1997. In addition to this book, I found more information about Captain Clark in the local Havana Journal. His trip north was to Havana, where he was put up in the home of Major William Skellinger, who was never in the military and received his title of major because he always led the village's parades. Here, Clark was to be cared for by Skellinger's daughter, Harriet, who was similar in age to Clark. Love blossomed during Clark's recovery, and by December, Clark was well enough that Harriet and he were married by the Reverend Sidney Wilbur on December 2nd, 1862. This fact was reported in the Havana Journal of December 13th, 1862. However, a week later, there was a notice in the December 20th edition of the paper that read as follows: died of consumption in this village, Saturday, December 13th, at the residence of her father, William Skellinger, Mrs. Harriet Skellinger Clark, wife of E.C. Clark, age 25 years, 11 months, and 26 days. This is just one of the amazing personal stories of soldiers from this area that I found during my research of this regiment. Edwin does not write again until November 21st, when they are in camp at Antietam Ford, which was very near the former battlefield, and where they were now doing guard duty. He mentioned that there is said to be some very gay young ladies not more than a mile from their present camp. His future letters will very often make reference to the fact that there are young ladies either present or in the neighborhood, and it was not uncommon for persons from Elmira, including young women, to visit their camps. In addition, soldiers had romantic encounters with the Southern ladies, including, in some cases, even marriage. The regiment eventually moved further south to Hope Landing on the Potomac River and not very far from Chancellorsville. Their stay there would require the establishment of a formal cemetery just for their regiment's deaths from disease. Ultimately, these graves will be moved to a national cemetery. They participate in the battles of Chancellorsville on May 1st through the 3rd, 1863, and Gettysburg on July 2nd to 4th that same year. Edwin's next letter was written July 12th after the Battle of Gettysburg. Dear friend Ned, it was a horrible sight to pass over the battlefield the next day after the fight and see the dead Rebs piled up all along our line of battle. Also, the houses in the vicinity were either burned or pierced through with shell or solid shot. We, of course, buried their dead and took care of their over 600 wounded. I cannot give you any idea of the appearance of the battlefield after the fight. You must see it to get any idea of the devastation. Your friend, Ed Weller. You may have heard of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. Imagine, if you can, a large level field of many acres and filled with a charging mob toward the barricaded troops at a somewhat higher level who were basically taking target practice. This was the famous Pickett's charge. The Confederate Army killed were 25% of their force, or about 20,000 men who were killed. After the Battle of Gettysburg, members of each company in the regiment returned to Elmira on a recruiting mission. Edwin did spend some time with Nettie, but it is unclear how often he might have seen her or actually when he returned to the regiment. However, the regiment moved to Tennessee in October 1863, where they, along with the rest of the 12th Corps, would guard the railroad from Knoxville to Chattanooga through to May of 1864. After they arrived in Tennessee, Edwin was raised to the rank of first lieutenant. Duty in Tennessee did not include any battles, and for the most part, only minor exchanges with so-called bushwhackers. However, there were many social events for Edwin to attend to with locals, such as picnics, parties, and dances. The soldiers played baseball and participated in other events, and they even organized a glee club. A number of the officers rented rooms, and their wives came to visit for several weeks, and families were started. I was able to verify that at least one officer's wife had a baby 9 months after her visit. Edwin would never hesitate to mention that he encountered one or two fair young ladies, or that he attended a party where there were a number of them, or he was going to visit some at their home. Regardless of how many meetings he had, he said nothing would happen with Nettie and their relationship. What followed guard duty in Tennessee was marching with Sherman through Georgia and the occupation of Atlanta. Edwin's first letter from the city of Atlanta was dated September 15th, 1864, and he mentions marching into the city. Dear friend Net, when we marched into the city, a majority of those I saw were ladies. I saw some fine young ladies among them. I think I shall make it a point to form their acquaintance as soon as possible. He may have done that, but his duty in Atlanta was significant and did not leave him very much time for meeting young ladies, because the regiment only remained in the city for about a month or two. Edwin's regiment left Atlanta on November 15th, 1864, for the so-called March to the Sea, and Nettie would not hear from him again until his regiment arrived in Savannah. His very next letter was written on Christmas Eve, and Nettie appears to have had another suitor. Dear Nettie, in your letter of 20th November, you said you had given Mr. V a decided answer. He certainly took it less at heart than I should, but thank fortune it was not my doom. I have no doubt that Mr. Vale loved you. As for me, I could not help but love you. I have been thinking that I tremble when I think how near I came to almost losing you forever. With much love, I am your affectionate friend, Ed. The regiment then marched from Savannah, Georgia to Raleigh, North Carolina, where Edwin wrote on April 15th, 1865. There was one little incident occurred while we were, he starts out the letter net. There was one little incident occurred while we were riding through the city, which was highly pleasing. We were riding through a splendid street on which most of the fine residences were located, and passing an elegant mansion with a front yard and flower garden. But these were not the most attractive objects, for on the veranda stood two splendid looking ladies. We let our horses walk along as slowly as possible so as to get a good look at them. And when just in front of the veranda, one of the fair damsels blew a kiss at us. Who it was intended for, we did not know, but we all returned the compliment. The fair one seemed very much pleased over the affair, and of course we were. The war was now coming to the end, and he writes a letter on May 9th, 1865, while marching to Washington. My dear Nettie, we stop at all the plantations and find an abundance of young ladies whose company we enjoy at dinner. I am getting quite anxious that we should hurry things, get discharged, and get home to see you, my dearest earthly friend. Ever your devoted Ed. It is a real shame that Nettie's letters did not survive. His last letter was written near Washington, where they had participated in the Grand Review. It was written on May 27th, 1865. My dear Nettie, the dark clouds have nearly all disappeared, and soon we shall meet again. I trust never to be parted so long again. Nettie, you will have to be very careful, or you will frighten me at our first meeting. You must bear in mind what a modest youth I am, and how easily embarrassed. For if you don't, I may lose my composure and dignity and make a bad display of myself. Now, try to be cool and composed for my sake, won't you? I am thinking I shall accept you as my instructor to teach me how these affectionate demonstrations toward the fair sex should be made. I suppose you will not object to undertaking this task and train me, will you? You may consider yourself engaged for the job. I am feeling in good trim to have a train with someone tonight, but will wait patiently till I get home. Which with much love, Ed W. The regiment reached Havana on June 9th. Edwin went back to work at his brother's dry goods store. He and Nettie were married on November 15th, 1865, and in time, Edwin bought out his brother-in-law's interest and slowly became one of the village's leading merchants. Nettie, everyone agreed, was a good housekeeper and had ample experience helping out when her older sisters married and started raising families. In the next 15 years, Nettie bore 6 children, 4 girls and 2 boys. At the same time, Edwin would actively participate in the annual celebrations of his regiment, held typically in Elmira on September 17th, the anniversary of the battle at Antietam. Edwin would die in 1908 of a condition identified only as paralysis. It was more than likely that he suffered a stroke. In her 90th year in 1929, Nettie began to fail, and the author and his mother journeyed east to see her for one last time. They found her bedroom bedridden but alert. Her grandson Walter approached her bedside. She looked at him for a long moment, then, with a dazzling smile, threw back the bed covers and said, "Good morning, Mr. Mueller. Would you like to jump in?" One of her daughters, one of her daughters standing nearby gasped, saying, "Mother, that is not Mr. Mueller. That is your grandson, William Walton." Then, withdrawing to a corner of the room, her daughter added in shocked tones, "Louise, did you hear what mother said? Do you suppose?" Later, Walter asked who Mr. Mueller was. Was he someone she knew? His mother replied, "He was the Methodist minister long ago." Lastly, in May of 1996, Walton's niece, Sue Hackett of Lyons, Colorado, wrote a letter to the Chemung County Historical Center. She said that she would be visiting our area in June for the purpose of learning more about her great-grandfather, Edwin Weller, who served in the 107th New York Volunteers. And would there be possibly a local historian who might help her in locating material about the regiment? She further stated she was in possession of Weller's letters and his scrapbook. I met her and acted as her tour guide. Afterwards, we corresponded quite often for several years. During that time, she provided me with portions of 21 letters that were excluded from the book, and later a copy of the journal that Weller kept from March 1st, 1864 in Wartrace, Tennessee, to June 19th, 1865, when he was at home in the town of Veteran. His journal covered the period of Sherman's Georgia campaign through the end of Weller's service in the Army. Edwin's journal and letter content, Sue corresponded with additional source regiment, and I also have the 36th history of the 107th New York Regiment. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Okay, well, George, that was very interesting. And it was almost a personal view into their relationship. It was very, very good. Thank you. And anyone who has a question, please go to chat and list your question on chat. Okay. George, did you have other pictures you wanted to show?
Yes, I'd like to. I've got 10 photographs that of items that I've collected over the years. The first one is there were 3 colonels of the regiment during the course of the war. And the beginning is Van Valkenburg, who was previously an officer in the New York State militia and had a lot of military training. He went back to Congress after the first battle at Antietam. And the lieutenant colonel took over, who was Alexander Diven. He had no experience, who was an older gentleman, and he commanded the regiment at Chancellorsville, where he was lucky that they did not have much in the way of fighting in that particular battle. After that battle, he retired from the Army, which I should mention that officers could pretty much leave the service at any point in time. After he left, he requested that a officer from the New York 23rd Infantry Regiment take over, and Colonel Crane commanded the Regiment at Gettysburg and until the end of the war. This is a map that I drew, which shows their route that they marched. Took them 10 days to reach the battlefield at Antietam. And it shows the different towns in Maryland, which I'm somewhat familiar with because I lived for 10 years in Maryland.
Mhm.
But this shows to where they were stationed at Harper's Ferry immediately after the battle, and they moved up to Antietam Ford, where they guarded against Confederate incursion across from the Potomac River. This is my great uncle. He was a private in the 107th New York. He fought in Antietam. He was wounded and his left arm was amputated. He did come back home eventually and was married and had a child, but he died in his 30s. So possibly the wound did have some further effect on him. This is the Bible from Dunker Church, which is quite well known that the Bible was stolen from the church after the Battle of Antietam. It was stolen by a soldier in the 107th New York. He actually mailed it home, and it stayed there until his daughter gave it to John Lewis. If you recall, John Lewis was a friend of Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. And John Lewis was a Dunker, and he lived up near where we go for lectures in the summertime about Mark Twain. And he returned it to the Dunker Church, and it's now on display at the Visitor Center at the Antietam battlefield. This is the monument that was erected on Culp's Hill after many years after the Battle of Gettysburg. And it was visited ultimately at a celebration by the soldiers. And the next photo shows them at the monument. You can see the gentleman in the he's kind of in the back row with a top hat on. That's Colonel Crane. And those gentlemen there are all veterans of the 107th. And they were there celebrating the erection of the monument. And this is from Harper's Weekly on the front page. It's a picture of Sergeant Ebenezer Helms raising the flag atop the state capitol. At the time was Milledgeville, not Atlanta. And he's standing on top of the State House there with the flag. The 107th did police duty during the time that they were in Milledgeville on their way to Savannah. I only know of two of these. I have one. After I was not working anymore, I went to a lot of house sales looking for Civil War memorabilia because I was on eBay, and I was selling a lot of it to help out because I was on Social Security at that time. And this was a handout at the erection of the statue on Lake Street. I only know of two of them. I was at a house sale. I bought a book there. And when I got home, I discovered this handout was in the book. And this is Lieutenant Frank Frost, who was quite a personality. I ran across a newspaper article of him long after the war. He was married and had children, and he was the train station manager in Chemung. and some lady there became infatuated with him and tried to burn his house down. There's quite a bit of some stories about him. As you can see, he's a pretty good looking guy. After and the last item that I have, I went to a house sale, and I wandered through the house twice looking for things that might interest me. And I went through the third time, and I noticed this something on the wall. It was framed, and I saw the eagle. I thought, what is that? So I walked over to it, and it was a replacement discharge document for Frank Frost. And you can see the penmanship on it. It's amazing. And I have it framed and in my office at home. But you just can't imagine. I mean, I met the lady that had the letters and other documents. I found this. It's amazing. I went to house sales for a number of years and found many things that related to the Civil War. And that's my final picture.
Thank you so much. We have a question. First question is, we knew an Eddie Weller who was a member of Grace Episcopal Church and lived at Bragg Towers. We often transported him to church. Eddie died in the 1970s. Wonder if he was related.
I don't know that I don't know. I've never researched Edwin and Nettie's family, so I don't really know. Edwin died in the 1930s when he had a stroke, but I don't know anything about I know about the family going backwards, but not forwards.
Okay, and another question that we have is, was Crane a relative of Susie Crane, sister of Livy Clemens?
No, Crane was from Steuben County. He was not, he never lived in this area, so he's from Steuben County, as was Van Valkenburg. Van Valkenburg was also from Steuben County. Dibbin was the one, he was from, of course, from Elmira, was not a military person, had no training, and but he did stay in the service after he left command of the 107th.
George, was Divin an industrialist? Was he a person involved with the coal mining business, or?
I think so. Yes, he was an industrialist. They were actually his family's plot is right across the road from the Mark Twain plot up in the cemetery.
Mhm.
But he was very prominent Elmiran. I've never really studied his family at all, so I can't tell you too much, but they were, well, you've got Divin Plaza, and Divin Plaza was built, if you know where that is, on Lake Road.
Mhm.
That was actually the Divin estate. They had a very large family there, and the what was a shopping center at one time was named after the Divin family.
Mhm. We have another question or another comment. You might be aware that there is a Frost family in Montour Falls, Watkins.
Okay, Frost, the name Frost is that they may be related, but he was, his mother died when he was born. She died of childbirth. I don't know what the situation was with the father, but Frank's real name is not Frost. His family name is not Frost, was not Frost. And he adopted the family name, um, and and always went by that. But and I can't think of what his middle name was, but it was actually his real family name. As a young man, he walked horses on the Chemung Canal, and that's where he was working at the time when he joined the regiment.
You mentioned the estate. There's a question. Was that estate named Willowbrook?
Oh boy, I could find out easily enough, but I don't. I don't really. I just remember that it was the Divin property, and they named the shopping center after it. They may have been. I'm just not sure.
Okay. Okay. All right. That was very, very interesting, George. That was very enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for asking me to do it.
It was delightful. Thank you. So this is the last book sandwiched in for this spring. And we'll see you again in the fall with more interesting book reviews. And that'll be fun. That'll be fun. Thank you very much.